All right, look, welcome everyone. Looks as though we've got a good number of people on the call, so huge thanks everyone for joining us for this latest meeting of our Homelessness Research Network. Apologies for the slow start, entirely my fault and some technical problems I was having, but we'll press on from here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephen Aldridge, Director for Analysis and Data at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in the UK. I'm also a trustee and board member of the Centre for Homelessness Impact. There's too many of us on the call to introduce everyone, but please stand ready to say who you are if and when you contribute to the discussion. The purpose of this meeting, the purpose of the network that's created by these meetings is quite simple. It's to bring together homelessness researchers and users of homelessness evidence, to share knowledge and evidence and the latest research, to facilitate mutual problem solving and learning, and to make international and national connections for homelessness researchers. Once again, we've got a fascinating agenda with 2 presentations consistent with this purpose. This time focused on data linkage and predicting homelessness, and the ways in which existing data held in different places and by different organisations can be linked to prevent and predict occurrences of homelessness. As I suspect many on this call will be well aware, information that could be used to justify and target earlier intervention or prevention activity isn't necessarily available to the local authority that has the power to offer support. By linking data sets, risks of homelessness can be better identified to ensure targeted prevention activity to reduce the chances of homelessness. So our 2 presenters are going to discuss and build on these themes. Our first presenter is Neel Khokhar, a data scientist and project delivery manager at Xantura, one of the organisations that the Centre for Homeless Impact is working with to deliver its test and learn and systems-wide evaluation programme. Neel will discuss the development and use of platforms to link data. Our second presenter is Anna Humphreys, a data projects manager at the London Office of Technology and Innovation, a collaborative innovation team supporting London's local authorities and the Greater London Authority. Anna will be discussing the strategic insights tool that has been developed, which brings together London's chain data on homelessness with information held by local authorities so that homelessness can be better prevented and addressed. Please think about the questions you would like to ask our presenters as we go along, and there'll be a chance after each has spoken for you to put questions and comments too. You can use the chat function to post comments, share other relevant work, and ask questions as we go along. And then when we get to the discussion sessions, obviously there's scope to use the raised hand function too. I'll do my very best to pick up everyone's comments and questions, and I'd encourage everyone not to be shy about feeding in comments or asking questions, given the excellent speakers that we've got. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. Let me turn therefore to our first agenda item with Neel Khokhar, a data scientist and project delivery manager at Xantura. Xantura, as I say, is working with local authorities on a data science platform that will combine data to allow authorities better to identify households at risk of homelessness and to offer early support. So, Neel, you're incredibly welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to hearing about your work. So, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully, without any issues.
Yeah,
that's
there.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Neel. I work for a company called Xantura. We've been doing a fair bit of work in the last couple of years to look at using data to prevent homelessness. And so in the next 20 minutes, I'll be talking about the approach that we took and some of the key learnings we got on the way. I think just to provide a bit of context, it's worth knowing who we are as a company. I think that helps you understand the sort of angle we've taken towards answering this question. So as a way of introduction of the company, Xantura have been around for about 15 years now, which is much longer than I've been here. But their mission has always been the same. So Xantura have always worked with the public sector and with local governments. They've always worked with them to try and help them leverage the data they have to help make connections and support vulnerable people. So there was a whole series of wider work that Xantura did before approaching the problem of homelessness. But the approach to all of these problems is usually the same. It's always to see, can we find clues and insights from data that already exists to try and help people who might otherwise be missed by the system. In terms of a connection actually to the centre and the Ministry of Housing. So we're actually involved in the Test and Learn project, which the Centre of Housing, Homelessness Impact, is supporting on. And I think this is quite an exciting opportunity because this is, I think, the first time our work will be evaluated by an independent evaluator. So as part of that work, we're currently, well, we've been working for about a year now with 4 local authorities, which you can see on the screen. We're pretty much going live as we speak with a lot of them. We're reaching that exciting point of the project. And Varian will be independently evaluating the impact of this work. So I'm sure that will be a very exciting report for everyone to read when it eventually comes out. So just to frame the problem, I'm sure a lot of people on this call might be quite familiar with the problem of homelessness and sort of generally how it's approached and what the typical outcomes are, but I think it's a good place to start. So in England, when local authorities support somebody or a household when it comes to homelessness, a typical story is that that person might have approached the council to say that they may be facing eviction fairly soon, or that maybe they have already been evicted, or perhaps that the council became aware of them through a referral mechanism. But it's quite interesting to see what typically happens when the council first starts working with the household to support them for a prevention, either a prevention of homelessness or if they've already become homeless. So as an example, if we take 100 households who approach their local council or get approached by their local council, when that initial conversation happens, typically you'd expect that around 55 of them, so 55% of the households at that point will already become homeless. So this might mean that the initial conversation is, you know, I've just been evicted, or perhaps I'm getting evicted today. And that's the starting point of the interaction with the council. The other 45% are not homeless yet, but the reason why they're engaging with the council is because they may be imminently homeless. They may have been threatened with eviction at that point, and it's becoming a very real reality that they will soon be homeless and they don't have a plan for that. And that's where their starting point with the council is. So already you can see why prevention of homelessness is a really interesting topic, because a lot of the work that currently gets done is with people who are already homeless. So if we're focused on prevention, we're already starting slightly on the back foot there. The type of work that the council would do with these 2 scenarios does vary. So if you are in that 45 and you're approaching the council because you are on the brink of homelessness but not yet homeless, then of course their effort is to try and see if they can help you maintain your current tenancy or perhaps find you other suitable place to stay. And typically these are the outcomes. So of these 45, 31 may find themselves with some sort of sustained tenancy. but 14 will not, and they might end up in temporary accommodation. So we would still class that as homeless, and work with these 14 will continue. But at this stage, that's the typical outcomes. So it's a 69% sort of positive outcome, because what we want is to make sure that if there is someone at risk of homelessness, that they can be rapidly housed in some sort of suitable tenancy. For the 55 who are homeless at the beginning, the interaction's a little bit different. So councils will be working with them to try and get them back into some sort of stable accommodation. So that could be perhaps approaching the landlord who may have just evicted them to find out if they can get them back into that household, finding alternative solutions. But there are a lot more challenges in this circumstance. And you can see that in the results. So typically of these 55, you'd expect that 17 will end up in some sort of house solution, whereas 37 will not, and they might end up in temporary accommodation, which has a 31% positive outcome rate. So this is just a bit of a high-level snapshot. We don't really, and I don't like to just look at this from a purely numerical point of view, but this is, I guess, representative of the initial sort of interaction that councils will be having with residents on the matter of homelessness. And already there's quite a few things you can glean from this. So I think a few things that stand out to me is that, firstly, out of the 100 people, after this initial part of the process, 51% at the end are still homeless. And like I said, it doesn't quite end here. The council will keep working with them, but we're just focused on this initial part for now. And actually, if you look throughout this whole process at how many were homeless at some point, it's 69%. So what we want to do, ideally, is prevent people from experiencing homelessness at all. But as part of this process, there are a lot of people who will experience homelessness, even if for a short while. And that's something we want to avoid. And I think the second really notable thing is that the councils are a lot more successful in working with households who are not homeless yet. So this is when councils are working in a preventative manner. And you can see that they had a 69% positive outcome here. But there are so many more challenges when they are working with households who are already homeless that they have half the effectiveness. So as many of you might know, this is quite an expensive problem. A lot of the residents who experience homelessness at all throughout this process will find themselves in temporary accommodation at some point. And temporary accommodation is getting increasingly more and more expensive, and councils are resorting more and more to housing people in private residencies and paying their rent, or in bed and breakfasts, and nightly rates at those are skyrocketing. So homelessness costs England councils 9 billion per year, but to be honest, that's probably increasing so much. I always find myself having to check that number because of the rate that it increases, unfortunately. So given this problem, I would jump a little bit ahead to actually what we found and then talk through our process. But our experience with this has been that actually councils do hold quite a lot of data to give us insights of people's risk of homelessness. But as you'll see in a minute, there is some trouble we might face in accessing that data and making it usable. And we also found that actually when you focus more on prevention, and we've sort of seen this a little bit here in this diagram, councils become more and more effective in helping people. And the later you leave it, the more challenges there are in that person's life, which the council might find themselves ill-equipped to support on in a short time frame. So to give you a bit of a background about how we actually approached this problem, we had a few key questions right from the beginning. And it all centered around this typical journey that someone takes when they interact with the council. The first question was, can councils identify households earlier so they can be supported more effectively with a prevention duty? And what this means in the context of this diagram is, can we try and identify some of these 55 households earlier so that they become part of this 45? The reason is that we know that councils are a lot more effective at helping people at that stage. So if we can identify them earlier, we can expect to see better results. The second question was, if we are able to identify these 55 people earlier, can we identify perhaps some of these 45 people even earlier than they currently approach the council? So could we look at really early prevention before they've actually reached a point of crisis? And looking at this pattern, you might expect that therefore the councils will become even more effective, greater than 69% at supporting them. But that is actually a question we had to find out, which is, would that work? So firstly, are councils equipped to support people that early in the process? But also, would residents engage that early when they're not at a point of crisis? Would they maybe even recognize that they themselves might need that support? And these really go hand in hand because ultimately, identifying people early, as interesting as that might be, it doesn't make a difference unless councils can work with that and actually effectively support those people. So we made sure that we were constantly keeping that as part of our target throughout this. So in terms of the first problem, early identification, we did a few literature reviews to try and understand exactly what are the risk factors for homelessness. And they seem to be quite well understood. There's quite a lot of research around it. And what we wanted to see was, do councils actually have visibility of these risks? Because if they don't, then there's not much a council can do to try and identify a person early. What we noticed looking at this list here on the left is that quite a lot of this data in some way will sit with the council. But the challenge we have is that no single team will have full oversight of all of these risks. So looking at these on the left, if you're looking at financial instability, well, revenues and benefits might have an indication of somebody's financial situation. But then we also need to know some details of their housing insecurity, history of evictions and homelessness, poor housing conditions, or perhaps the housing options team might have good insight into that. Similarly, there's lots of wider risks around mental health issues, disabilities, substance misuse, relational factors like domestic violence is a really important one. All of these are relevant, and that information wouldn't usually sit so directly with perhaps the revenues and benefits team, but children's and adult social care might have some visibility on those issues too. Similarly with care leavers, prison leavers, and so on. So the first challenge was realizing that the data does exist, but it's spread out across separate teams in the council. There's also other organizations that councils will work closely with who would add even more details here, so housing associations, NHS and police. And this could help give us the complete picture, but the challenge is that they're all distinct and separate systems. So the first thing that we needed to do to approach this was to use a multi-agency approach and bring this data together so we actually had full visibility of the problem and we weren't just looking at it through one lens. It's worth saying that in our experience so far, as an organization, we have worked with the police and NHS in this way, but not for homelessness specifically. But for homelessness, we have worked with quite a few housing associations who have a close relationship with the council and have been willing to work with the council to share some of their data on rent arrears. But all of these other parts of the council, we do work really closely with. So this can provide a challenge because all of the data is held by different teams who currently usually work in silos, and it's very difficult for that data to be matched and put together. So a big part of our work is actually just getting that data into one place and having that single view of a resident and of a household, rather than 4 or 5 separate views. So we found that the data is there. The question then is, can we use that data to try and identify households early? So the way we undertook this is, firstly, we looked at the history of people who became homeless. And we then went to look at what data did the council have through these different teams of those people prior to their homelessness. Now, this varies by a few factors. But we actually found that generally councils do have quite high visibility. It ranges in our experience from about 25 to 60%. Now, what this means is that depending on the amount of data that we were able to collect from the councils and the amount of teams that we worked with, but also sometimes just the size of the council and the amount of data available, sometimes the prevalence of homelessness at that council. Sometimes 25% of those who become homeless had data alluding to these risks sitting in the council beforehand, specifically 3 to 12 months prior to the point where they became homeless. Now, even if you take the lower bound of that, 25%, 25% of the homelessness problem is a really significant amount. And especially when you consider the costs of homelessness, that is a really large amount for the council to actually start supporting early, given that it might be possible now for us to actually see that. If you're wondering what that looks like in practice, well, rather than just looking at the data, we did also conduct case studies with some local authorities. These 3 case studies came from one local authority. And you can see that actually, when you look at it holistically, it seems like it should have been obvious. It seems like the signs were all there. But the trouble was that there wasn't a single team who had visibility of those signs. So I won't go through all of these in too much detail, but I think some really interesting ones. This first case study is an example where children's social care were aware that a note for eviction had been served. Now, what should have happened there is that this should have been immediately referred to the housing team to offer wider support, but that didn't happen. And that means that there is an opportunity for human or systematic error there, which means that the only time that the council became aware, the only time the housing team became aware was the day before the notice was due to expire, and that's because she contacted the council herself. Now, this might not be representative of every council, but it shows that there are gaps and there are mistakes that can happen, and it requires everyone being very coordinated in order for that not to happen. A second case study here is of somebody who was in social housing and was receiving an eviction notice after accruing £4,500 in rent arrears. That's 9 months of rent. Again, there's an opportunity there for the social housing team to contact the council and make them aware of this earlier. But where do you draw that limit? And I think if you give the housing team access to this data and they can see that coming, perhaps this person could have been supported when they only had maybe a few £100s of rent arrears. And also maybe what wider risks would this person have had, which caused them to get into these arrears. Something I find really interesting about this case study is that what the council had to do was they were seriously considering just paying off the rent arrears and clearing the £4,500. And that's because they knew what the cost would be if they put them into temporary accommodation. But that doesn't really address the question. When we asked why did they get such high rent arrears, the council found they didn't really have time to really dig into that. It was such an imminent eviction that they had to address, that they were essentially looking for a short-term fix, and that's completely understandable given the circumstances. But it made us think, if we worked with this person earlier, what kind of support would be available, because we might not need such a quick fix. So we became confident that it is possible to try and identify people early and that the data is there. But that's not useful unless the council are equipped to actually support those people. And the only way to do that is to put this into practice and go live with the council. And so we conducted a pilot with Maidstone in Kent, where we surfaced alerts to them based on this data we were receiving of people who we think had all the necessary risks, which suggested they would be at risk of homelessness. And they went and actually had an interaction with them to see, can they support them? And these are the outcomes of that study. So we generated 650 alerts. So these are 650 distinct households we made them aware of. The council worked through from the top downwards. So they started with the most urgent cases, and they managed to address 40% of those cases. And they were limited by their own capacity more than anything, which means that 60% just went through business as usual. They weren't addressed by this particular team. And you can see such drastic results. So the 40% they contacted, 0.4% of them became homeless. But you can only really put that into context when you look at what happened to the 60% which they didn't contact, which is 40% of them became homeless. So what we learned is that we were able to identify people who early, so 40% of them. But also, most importantly, the council were incredibly well equipped to support people. And apart from a very small minority, essentially, if the council were aware of you, and if you're at risk of homelessness this early, it seems like they could prevent you from becoming homeless. There's a lot they could do. Part of the reason for that is that they found that because their engagement was no longer crisis driven, it opened the door for a much wider array of interventions. They used a lot of benefits maximization work, employment support to get people back into work, debt support. And they felt like they were really addressing the fundamental issue that was causing this person to maybe build up debts or become at risk of homelessness or eviction. They also saved £225,000 by working with these people early, with a potential saving of just shy of £600,000 if they were able to address all 650 alerts, which is a really significant part of their housing budget. I realise I've gone slightly over time, but I do just have one slide left, which is just to say that although we see this as a really successful pilot, to do this with councils, there are some really big challenges. So firstly, the fact that we work with multiple data sets across different systems mean we really require local authorities to be coordinated and lots of teams to be brought into this and to share the data. That's a really large technical challenge. But also from an information governance point of view, there's just a lot of data involved, which we have to be careful of. But also a lot of the useful information comes from case notes. So especially that comes from adults and children's social care. So a case note might tell us that somebody is facing domestic violence risks, and we have to extract that information using text analytics, which again is another technical challenge that maybe not everyone has available to them. And the final challenge is that given the state of the homelessness problem in the UK at the moment, councils are not short of capacity. Not short of work. There is a lot of people turning up every day at the door who need support for homelessness. And so actually it requires a bit of a cultural shift to say we are going to divert some of our resource to work in this preventative way with people who might not be at a point of crisis just now, so that we can realize better outcomes in the future. That's everything from me. Sorry for running over a little bit. I'll hand back to Stephen. I think we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Neel. Fantastic presentation. Really fascinating. We've got some time for comments and questions. If anyone would like to raise something, please use the raised hand function or put something in the chat box and I'll bring you in to ask a comment or question. But whilst people are thinking, let me perhaps lead off. So a couple of things from me, Neel. First of all, it's a fantastic sort of exploratory study. I'd be interested in your views on, how generalizable do you think your findings are across local authorities generally? And second thing was, you show a huge difference in outcomes between those instances where people were contacted and those instances where they were not. To what extent, though, were the people in those two categories sort of matched? I mean, it might be that those who were more readily contacted were the easier cases. I mean, I'm not saying that is the case, but how can we be confident that difference, reflects the ability to intervene earlier and that's more successfully?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that is a real limitation of that work, which is that was not really a true control group or a fair study, as it were, for a couple of reasons, which is that the ones that they contacted, we expected them to be the more high-risk ones. However, anyone who they didn't get through to, anyone who perhaps just wasn't interested in receiving support, would end up in that in the other group. So to a certain extent, that's skewed by the fact that they would be working with those who may be more receptive to support, and perhaps that's because it was more obvious to them that they needed it, and therefore that's a case we'd expect higher success. But we weren't. So I think Maidstone weren't too comfortable doing this as a controlled trial. They wanted to obviously help as many people as possible. So we tried to get some learnings from those who they just didn't manage to get through to. But I think that's why actually the work that we're doing at the moment for the test and learn is really important, because that will be a true randomized study. So we will be completely splitting our cohort in half and seeing what happens to those groups. So hopefully that will be where we can get true insight into that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Look, great work. Let me bring in Amarjit Baines. Could you introduce yourself first, Amarjit? I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Stephen.
And then introduce yourself and then ask your question, please.
Sure. My name's Amarjit. I'm from Bridges Outcomes Partnership. Neel, this is really positive. I love this stuff. I'm a big fan of upstream work, so this is fantastic. I was just curious, of all the different data sets you had, was there any particular one that you had more success with? Like, was it in relation to individuals that were referred via DWP data or someone else?
It's a good question. So we do, when we sort of propose this moving forward, we do split our range of data sets into sort of what we call our core data sets and then enhanced data sets. The reason being mainly is that we realize that there's a challenge in providing everything. Sometimes local authorities just think, we're not going to be able to get data from the adult social care team, as valuable as that might be. If we had to try and narrow down the data sets, we would rather have sort of all of those financial ones than some of the financial ones and some of the wider risk ones. So typically we look at data such as council tax arrears, discretionary housing payments, housing benefit overpayments, and rent arrears. Those are sort of our central four, which give us visibility on debts. But a lot of the value, I think, comes from that unstructured data, things like case notes, where you can find out, it adds a bit of context. You can see that someone's debt were rising, and at the same time, we noticed that suddenly they'd stopped work or there'd been a bereavement in the family. I think without that context, it is a little bit just numbers on a page. But when we surface the cohorts to local authorities, we don't just give them a list. Because we've already looked at all of that data, we give them a case summary, which will give them some of that context to say, this might explain what you're seeing in the data. So I suppose at the risk of saying the more the better, realizing that we can't always get all of the data, I think the financial data provides a pretty good foundation.
Fantastic. Let me bring in a couple other people who've raised questions. So first of all, Sharon McLaughlin, you've got a question in the chat box. Can I ask you to introduce yourself, Sharon, and then put your question, please?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I'm Sharon McLaughlin. I'm a community safety and housing practitioner. And I was just... Brilliant presentation, Neel. Thank you ever so much on that. And like the lady before me has just said, I'm a bit of a data geek myself. I love all this. But I was surprised to see in the arrears case that the social housing provider hadn't referred into the homeless prevention team at that pre-eviction protocol. And I just wondered if that was something that you found in your data sets. Was that a common error that was coming up? Because my understanding is that they have a duty, to inform the homeless prevention team.
Yeah. So in that particular case, you'd be pleased to hear the council took that very seriously, that finding. They weren't expecting to see that either. But what we actually, just to give a bit more detail of that exercise, what we did there was, rather than looking through the lens of our data, we went on site and we did deep dives into cases where we looked back and found out what their risks were and what their interactions with the council had been beforehand. And that's what revealed this. The housing team, the people who are actually engaging with the residents, said that this was actually quite common, again, for that particular local authority. And so that did end up getting flagged to the senior stakeholders at the local authority, who took it really seriously. But it did prompt an interesting question for us, which is that we receive a variety of data sets, and one of the really interesting things we've noticed is that in HCLIC data, which is where we would see the date that somebody was assessed and then maybe put on a duty for homelessness prevention or relief, we get those dates coming through in our data, But we noticed that sometimes in local authorities, our model that looks at homelessness seems to always see a sign of homelessness coming, a couple of weeks before, sometimes a few months before. When we addressed this, we found it was coming from social care case notes. And you can sometimes see a journey where somebody had engaged with a social worker to say, I think if I remember a specific case actually from a local authority, they were worried that their landlord was going to take them to court because of the amount of mess that they were making. Their landlord was saying it's too messy in the house. And then their landlord saying that they're going to perhaps evict them at some point. And all of this is, signs that we should be picking up on. But that journey and that conversation kept carrying on, escalating and escalating and escalating. And it was 86 days before they actually got assessed by HCLIC. And when they did get assessed, they were put straight on a relief duty. So it was following the eviction. And that really showed us how much was missed in that journey. I won't say I have a really good answer about why that's being missed. And it's obviously something that in theory shouldn't, and people should be aware of it. And in that case, it's quite obvious. There were some instances where we think actually, if you're not looking at this from the lens of risk of homelessness, it can be missed sometimes. Maybe not in the case of £4,500 rent arrears or someone being threatened with eviction so directly, but perhaps if someone's showing signs and is domestic violence risk and so on, the social worker is probably addressing quite a lot of other needs. And we can see why it might be possible. So I think the interesting thing from the data perspective is that it adds an extra safety net, which is that we obviously want to promote and prioritize duty to refers. But given that they are sometimes missed, if we just made sure that that data was connected and this could just be an automated flag, I think that'd be a really good safety net.
Brilliant. Look, I'm going to take one more question now, then I'm going to move on to Anna, and I'll say something about the other questions in the chat box in a moment. But before that, can I ask Beth Isaac to join us? Beth, you've got a couple of questions in the chat box there. Do you want to introduce yourself and put your two questions, please?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Stephen. I was just typing a third question actually.
Well,
from
three
CHI.
questions are welcome too.
Okay, so I work in the evidence and data team at CHI, so can always get my questions answered elsewhere. But I was really interested about just to hear with your sort of involvement with the councils you've been working with, whether they're kind of seeing this and getting their heads around it, and then having ideas for kind of other applications, or thinking whether that's other applications of the linked data that you're creating, or other applications of the approach elsewhere with other data sets. And I think it's maybe as a sort of side point for later, but just also really interested to hear how the text analytics works, because I think that is something that's a little bit newer to a lot of people who maybe have analysts, but the text analytics is kind of been taking massive advances in recent years.
Yeah, it has. Just on the first point, the connected data is probably the most valuable part of this process for a lot of local authorities, because for various technical reasons, it's extremely challenging. In summary, there isn't a single code or ID number in social care that you could map to someone in the Revs and Ben system. So we can't say that for sure that's the same person. And if you were to look at names and addresses, well, one system might have slightly out of date addresses and names and so on. And so it's quite complicated to try and actually identify, are we looking at the same person's data across these different data sets? So getting that right is pretty much at the core of all of this. And once we've done that, yeah, you're right, that conversation does then open up about what else we can do with that. And like I said, homelessness is quite a recent thing that we've worked on. But we also do work across falls prevention, single view of debt, serious violence, parental eviction as well. So it's sort of ever increasing scope, but it's always rooted in the idea that as a council, you have a lot more visibility than you think. But the challenge is the data is kept in silos. And so once it's connected, it opens up quite a lot of doors.
Brilliant. Look, thank you so much, Neel. Another great question. As colleagues have said, fantastic presentation. Seems to me undoubtedly the direction of travel in which we ought to be following. In order to make sure that our next speaker is going to have enough time to do a presentation, get some questions to, I'm going to move on. But just to say, Neel, there are some other questions and comments on your presentation in the chat box. You might just want to annotate some responses to those, or if we've got time after the next presentation, we can return to these. But there's some good further questions in the chat box, which would be nice to answer. But for now, Neel, huge thanks. Let me turn though to our second presentation by Anna Humpleby, Data Projects Manager at the London Office of Technology and Innovation, who's developing a tool to align London's chain data on homelessness with information held by local authorities to enable homelessness prevention. So very much in the same vein as our first presentation, but Anna, very keen to hear from you too and have a conversation about your work. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Stephen, and hi everyone. Really nice to see you all. I am just going to share my slides with you, and if you just give me a shout when you can see those.
Yeah, Anna, your slides are there.
Perfect, that's great. Well, yeah, great to see everyone today. So my name's Anna Humpleby. I'm the Data Projects Manager at Lottie, which is the London Office of Technology and Innovation. And yeah, I'm going to be speaking to you about our approach to sort of data linking for supporting homelessness and rough sleeping interventions, specifically in London. So just wanted to start with a bit of an introduction to who Lottie is for those who might not be familiar with us. So we kind of describe ourselves as London Local Government's collaborative innovation community. So we are a local government organisation, and we're made up of a membership of London boroughs. So currently that's 28 out of the 33 boroughs and the Greater London Authority. And we really exist to support those organisations to work together to make better use of innovation, data and tech to improve services and tackle some of London's biggest challenges together. So a real focus on collaboration. We know there are a lot of kind of shared challenges and pressures, and we believe in trying to solve those once rather than kind of 33 times at the individual borough level. You can see on the screen here, there's kind of 4 main areas that we work across. So people, tech, data and methods. So I'm primarily working in that data quadrant, but also dipping into the others. And at the bottom there, you'll see kind of 4 of our thematic areas of focus, which we do a lot of project work in. And one of those is housing and homelessness, which is where this project fits in. So onto this specific project, I'm just going to start with a video just to give you a bit of an overview of the project, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. So hopefully the tech is going to work for us and the video will play, but if someone could just give me a shout if there's any issues with that.
Homelessness and rough sleeping is an issue for London, and it's a growing issue for London. It's been a particular issue for the people at the sharp end, of course, the people sleeping rough on our streets, and we've, in the last year, unfortunately had 12,000 people sleeping rough on the streets of London. I'm Tom Copley. I'm the Deputy Mayor of London for Housing and Residential Development. The Mayor has a really ambitious pledge to end rough sleeping by 2030. Lottie is London's innovation and collaboration team. We work with them very closely at the GLA, and one of the biggest pieces of work that they've done in the last year has been the Strategic Insights tool for rough sleeping.
I'm Anna Humpleby. I work as a data projects manager at the London Office of Technology and Innovation. Homelessness journeys are complex. Individuals interact with lots of different services, so that data sits in lots of different systems. The Strategic Insights tool at its heart is about matching data sets on homelessness and rough sleeping that sit in lots of different places The tool collects individual level data that goes through a matching engine which uses machine learning to identify matches between those systems and see aggregate numbers and trends of this is how many people are in this type of accommodation, this many people left for this reason, providing them with those sort of patterns.
People who sleep rough are likely to encounter many different agencies. So by being able to knit together approximately 50 different data sets, we can build up a much better picture that allows us to make sure that we are commissioning and tailoring services that really will benefit the people that they need to benefit, and that we're addressing any gaps that exist in provision.
So hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction into what it is that we've been working on. I guess just a bit of additional context, and we've heard a little bit about this already from Neel, and I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to any of you on this call. But as we know, rough sleeping in London and indeed across London and across England, is continuing to increase, and we really have sort of reached a bit of a crisis point now. So it's sort of become clear that we need to be thinking about this a little bit differently, and what sort of other approaches we can put forward to addressing this. I think in London we dedicate a large amount of public resources towards addressing homelessness and rough sleeping. So it's important that we're practicing good stewardship of those resources. Ensuring that any interventions are led by the outcomes that we want to achieve. So what are those kind of real world changes that we want to see, and making sure that they've got a clear sort of data and evidence base behind them. We know that there is a lot of data that exists in this space already, but traditionally that has been very siloed. So sitting across kind of a multitude of different systems with no routine way of connecting them. But actually, individuals who are experiencing rough sleeping or other forms of homelessness, are typically interacting with lots of different institutions, systems, and stakeholders. So they're, suffering from that lack of join up by having to tell that story multiple times, always starting a new interaction from square one, and not always being sort of appropriately informed or suffering from endless signposting. So this project really is designed to help bring together some of that data from across the wider ecosystem, and provide insights to users that are actionable. So I think a particular focus for this work is prevention, and the tool that we developed really seeks to improve understanding of the relationship between being vulnerably housed, statutory homelessness, and rough sleeping. So, how, when, why, who is transitioning from one to the other, what are the gaps that people are falling through, and where are those opportunities that exist for us to kind of intervene and prevent that journey. So I've talked a little bit about some of the aims, but I think, just a little bit more on this. I think England, and perhaps particularly London, is in a bit of a moment at the moment. So, a new national government, sort of fresh mandate to do things differently, and a real genuine ambition to reverse the recent trend of worsening homelessness and rough sleeping. So really important that we can, measure success in that, in being able to accelerate that end to homelessness, making sure that we can sort of effectively inform public policies, how we're designing and delivering services, and the services that are being commissioned at a local level. Just being able to improve our overall understanding of the homeless and rough sleeping population, so that complexity of needs, how individuals are interacting with different parts of the system that are designed to provide them with support. I mentioned there's a lot of data that exists, but really making sure that we're utilising that to the full potential. And I think something that was really important for us is creating something that was really flexible. So conditions and issues change rapidly in this area of work. We know that there will be new challenges, new needs that will arise. So yeah, really important that we could create something dynamic that could be put to work on those kind of as yet unknown needs. And hopefully by doing all of this, you know, promoting more joint working and data collaboration within this space. So I've talked a lot about what we were aiming to do, but I guess just to talk a little bit about what the tool actually is and how that works. So the Strategic Insights Tool, or the SIT, as we call it for short, aims to provide decision makers across London local government with a clearer view of homelessness and rough sleeping in their local area. And it does that by merging and integrating multiple sources of data. And at the moment, that's 3 key data sets. So firstly, the chain database that exists in London, which captures information about people who are seen bedded down on the streets by outreach teams. Inform, this is a case management system used by various service providers, which captures interactions with accommodation. And then thirdly, HClick, so local authority data sets on statutory homelessness applications. So what this means is, for the first time, users of the tool can see sort of aggregated journeys of rough sleepers over time as they're showing up through touch points in these different systems, and really starting to build up that picture of how they move through the wider system as a whole. So how does that all actually work? We tried to put this into more of a simple diagram, but I'll sort of take you through the key steps involved. So we've got kind of 4 main steps really. So firstly, the data is uploaded, and that's done at individual client level. So uploaded by each of the data providers, that's all 33 London boroughs, 9 accommodation providers, and chain. There's an option for that to be done manually, so kind of directly uploading to the system, or using automation, depending on the organisation's preference. Now, secondly, as you can imagine, as we get data from lots of different organisations, the sort of layout and the way that they name various fields can differ. So an example on the screen here around date of birth, you can see those various different ways of naming that field, so that we can understand what each of those means and sort of be able to bring that data together. We map and transform the data to a single interpretation. So you'll see on the right-hand side of that part of the diagram. That then allows us to move to the third step, so matching the records from each system. And we use a probabilistic matching algorithm here. It's called Splink, so that's an open source package developed by the MOJ. And it uses machine learning techniques to try to identify any matches between records across systems. So, for example, that algorithm might detect that, John Smith, who previously completed a homelessness application within Lambeth, so within a specific area of London, has also appeared in bedded down contacts by housing outreach officers in Wandsworth, so in another area. So that would be one record from HClick and one record from Chain. So where a match is identified, those individual records relating to the person are associated with one another and combined into a single record, or a kind of single rough sleeping journey, as you might say. Worth noting that it will only associate records that meet an 85% probability of being a match, so to kind of give us a high level of confidence in that final match data set. And then finally, those different journeys are aggregated and used to create visualizations that offer insights to the users based on data gathered from those individual systems. So yeah, worth noting that whilst we receive data at the individual client level to enable that matching to take place within the tool and the sort of user interface that people interact with, all the data is anonymized and aggregated. So it shows kind of trends and patterns at that cohort or population level. So very much not designed to be a case management system, but about sort of affecting change at that more strategic level. I just wanted to touch a little bit on sort of early use cases and impact from the tool. So yeah, this is just a few examples of some of the insights that are available within the tool. So things like length of stay in accommodation and how that differs across different types of accommodation. I mentioned we're sort of trying to map out journeys a bit more, so looking at destinations. So after someone is, after people have left a specific type of accommodation, where are they going on to next? Are they finding more settled solutions? Are they going back to rough sleeping, for example, and in what time frame? There's insights into local authority housing option services. So those homelessness applications, are they being made before or after rough sleeping? What are the sort of demographic breakdowns of people who have made an application to the local authority? And we also have quite a few different sort of filter options on the data. So geographically being able to look at it at borough, sub-region or pan-London level, pick a specific time period. So we've actually got data going back to January 2022, so just over 3 years of data now. So that's starting to sort of build up over time. So yes, just a few examples of what users will be able to see in that tool. I think to demonstrate sort of some of the early value we've seen from the tool, I think from the strategic perspective, it's allowed us to test sort of our assumptions that we had as a project team. So, we sort of came into this with certain things that we might expect to see from the data or when we brought this data together. And I think a key finding of some of that is that people who are sleeping rough might not be getting through the door as much as expected, or not being recorded in housing option systems in the way that we would expect as well, which has been a really valuable bit of learning for us. I think on the sort of data governance side of things, it's been a really huge achievement. The project's enabled data sharing and linking across over 40 organisations, so local authorities and the voluntary sector as well, and getting all of those parties to sign off on a single data sharing agreement. So yeah, sort of a really big achievement on that side of things. And then I've also just got a couple of quotes from users as well. So some examples of sort of early adoption of the tool and how it's being used. I won't go through all of these, but I think a few to point out is myth busting. We've heard that from a lot of people. So sort of helping boroughs figure out what's actually going on in their local area, as opposed to assumptions that might have been made for a long time. So, maybe thinking that a lot of rough sleepers were coming from, one borough into their borough, and that not always being the case. I think providing new insights into like why people end up rough sleeping in the first place, being able to work more effectively with providers to commission more strategically based on the data. And I think also a really useful secondary benefit has been that users have actually been able to kind of identify gaps in their own data, and some of the boroughs are taking proactive steps to address this, which is really encouraging to see. Just pointing out, I guess, a couple of key strengths and enablers for the project. So I think what's really crucial is that we had quite a solid data foundation to build from. So I mentioned the chain database. So, London already has this comprehensive sort of multi-agency database recording information about people sleeping rough and the wider street population. So that provided us with a really good basis to kind of further build up those journeys. I think the sort of partnership working involved in this has been really crucial as well. So obviously working with the Greater London Authority and London councils, but also sort of having the backing and sponsorship of central government from MHCLG, both from a funding perspective, but also from that kind of strategic direction as well. And also sort of positive endorsement from housing directors across London, with some individuals who've kind of really championed this work. And finally, and I touched on this on the last slide, but I think the really sort of well-established information governance mechanisms that we have in place in London, driven by us at Lottie, but with the Information Governance for London group, which exists to kind of support data collaboration and sharing projects at this scale. I think, before starting this work, we were aware that previous attempts to do this kind of project in London had failed, largely due to not being able to get that sort of data sharing right. So doing it right this time has been really, really key for us. Obviously, also a couple of challenges and lessons learned from this as well. Again, I won't go through all of these, but I think just to point out a few. As I mentioned previously, we had a lot of expectations and assumptions about the data and what we would get from this system. So I think crucially, we built the tool expecting there to be a really large overlap between the outreach data and the local authority data. And through the deployment of the tool, we've established that that's not quite the case. But it's led us to do sort of further investigations into why that is happening, and why sort of people might not be getting access to homelessness assessments in the way that we would expect, or also looking at sort of data collection practices as well. So that's leading us to be able to make some recommendations to how those practices and processes could be improved. I think we're operating in an ever-changing kind of policy environment, which is a big challenge to a project like this. Issues can change sort of more quickly than we can keep up with sometimes, but also I think it demonstrates the need for rapid and ever-changing data insights, which is why tools like this are necessary. And I'm just going to move on because I'm aware of time. But I think, just lastly, wanted to point out, I guess, where we are now and what the final next steps are with this. So I think, to summarize, we're in quite a good place, having created and operationalized this tool. We've got data being ingested regularly from around 50 individual data sets. We're sort of constantly looking at the underlying algorithms and seeing how those working and could be improved, working through data quality issues as they arise, and really working as a sort of project team to identify and test hypotheses going forward. So I think the things we're sort of working on next, I think in line with the sort of change that we're seeing from central government to look not just at kind of rough sleeping separately, but other forms of homelessness. We really want to sort of widen the scope of this tool to ensure better data join up across all the different forms of homelessness. And I think one sort of key use case is supporting more rationalized data collection. So we know there's a lot of data collection activities happening in this space. Sort of a new need arises, data starts being collected, but actually a lot of that data might already be being collected for another reason, and we want to kind of reduce the burden on local authorities having to collect and then submit the same data to lots of different organizations. So seeing how we can sort of rationalize and make that more efficient. And then secondly, and really importantly, incorporating new data sets. So we've started to sort of build that foundation of how people are moving between the streets, between local authority housing option services and accommodation, but recognizing that is only still a small part of the picture. And we want to make sure that we can, build out those journeys even further by bringing in other data sets. So sort of looking at things like prison and probation service, parts of the health system, more on temporary accommodation, which we know is a big challenge and pressure for lots of local authorities at the moment. But just, ensuring that we are continuously doing that sort of user needs scoping and consultation, so we can build out those use cases and use this tool to kind of meet a wider set of needs. So I think that was it from me, and happy to take any questions. I think you're on mute, Stephen.
You're quite right. The dreaded mute button. A truly fantastic presentation and a really, really interesting. So much here. for us to get into. Can I ask colleagues, if you've got comments or questions, please raise your hand. There's one or two questions already in the chat box, which I'll come to in a moment. Just to thank Neel for responding so assiduously to the questions we weren't able to take following his presentation. But just one thing from me before I bring in others, Anna, do you want us to say a little bit more about, to what extent do you think your work has enabled earlier or more effective interventions?
Yeah, good question. I think, as I said at the beginning, I think prevention is something that we're all thinking about and something we're keen to support more, for sure. I think at the moment, as I said, we've built out a certain proportion of what that journey might look like for someone, but we know we're still only capturing like part of the picture right now. And I think as we begin to build that out and can build those more end-to-end journeys, I think that's where we'll be able to make the sort of more preventative efforts. But it's certainly sort of showcasing insights into how, as I said, sort of how people might not be sort of getting through the front door as much as expected. And I think there's perhaps sort of more work to be done on that side of things. So I think it's not just about, what the data is telling us about what the data is telling us, but also what it's sort of highlighting around, processes and practices that exist and how we can support that through the data, as well as supporting, individuals in these journeys.
Okay, thank you. Shelley Harrod, you've got a comment in the chat box for Anna. Do you want just to introduce yourself and put your question, please?
Yeah, so I'm Shelley Harrod, so I'm the head of the Research and Intelligence Unit at AMCO, which is the new East Midlands County Combined Authority. I think it was a comment and a kind of like link in, really, and Kirsty's been kind enough to respond, but we've been around a year now. One of the big areas of the mayor's kind of, one thing she wants to do, she wants to set up this homelessness task force. So we have started that kind of engagement. We've had a few events, we've had a bit of a sharing situation. I think we've got to that point where we're looking at what we can do and we feel like we want to work together. We've got a challenge in that we've got the 4 constituent councils, but we've got districts and boroughs within the area, and that data sharing is it's a massive challenge for us. So understanding maybe how GLA managed to overcome that, given the fact that they've always also got a lot of local authorities, really is a question to me, and maybe a conversation that we might want to take offline, really, just kind of understanding that, because that model and that insight and giving us that information, I think, is really key to support that task force work.
Yeah, for sure. I think we'd be really happy to have a conversation offline about this further. But yeah, I think we've sort of established, I mentioned the Information Governance Group for London, which does exist to support projects like this to happen. I think there's a lot we can probably share from that. And we've also sort of published some of our documentation from this project on the Lottie website as well, which will give it a bit of an insight into sort of how we tackle the data sharing elements of this. But yeah, definitely happy to have a more wide conversation around
I'll locate that. How do you spell that? Sorry, so I get that right. Lottie. I know you've just shared all those slides, but I think they've gone now. So
sorry, it's just LOTI. I'll pop a link
Can you put an email address or contact in the chat box, and others
Absolutely.
can follow up? I think there are others like Kirsty would like to follow up as well on that. So yeah, it'd be great for you to get together. Can I turn to Jean Davis? You've raised a question about data access. That may be as much for Neel as Anna's presentation, but it's a very good question. Do you want to just raise your question, Jean? Obviously, please introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Jean Davis. I look after the Changing Futures evaluation. So actually my question was for Anna, and I think it's probably already been asked, but I think we would also be really interested in understanding how that data sharing happened. Kirsty and I maybe come across the same kind of challenges when we do our work. So I think a really interesting model that we'd be keen to see whether we could replicate.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I think I can just come on that quickly, but yeah, I think we can have a discussion offline as well. But I think for us in London, we sort of established a more collaborative process of designing data sharing agreements. So, rather than a project team sort of coming up with it and going to information governance leads who, often don't really know what this project is or what it's trying to do, having those conversations really early and having a sort of representative group of London. So maybe there's 7, 8 of us who can actually sit down and come up with that data sharing agreement together, work through the legal gateways and so on. And yeah, sort of have a working group session where at the end of that you kind of have your draft agreement, which that group is happy to sign off, and then there's a sort of trusted process within the group that if these 8 people are happy to sign it off, we're happy to sign it off. We are actually in the process of putting together a bit of a toolkit on how to do sort of data sharing projects like this, which should hopefully be up on the website soon as well. So I think those sort of resources should be helpful. But yeah, really happy to have a conversation outside of this meeting.
Thank you so much. Good question, and thank you so much, Anna, for that offer. You'll put your contact details in the chat box, please. Let me come back to Amajit Baines again. You've got a question too, I think.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, Anna. Really interesting presentation. I was just wondering, did you look at at what point the individual became a rough sleeper? What was the driving issue that turned them into a rough sleeper? I just think there's a lot of marriage between you and our last presentation where they're looking upstream at prevention. And if we were able to get the 2 data sets together, it might actually give a super clear picture of how we prevent rough sleeping in the first place.
Good question.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's definitely alignment with the work as you've mentioned. And yeah, I think we're sort of, keen to stay in touch with other bits of work that are ongoing and seeing how they can work together. I think, as I sort of mentioned in the presentation, we've been looking at this as more of a I guess like a cohort level or a population level rather than individuals. But one of those things it is trying to do is, what's the journey? So what's the journey into rough sleeping and through it and back out the other side. So I think we're starting to see some of those, but as I said, I think we're still quite limited by the fact we've only got 3 data sets in there, and also the overlap between the chain sort of outreach data and the local authority data is actually really quite small. So the level of matching is maybe not what we expected it to be. So I think there's definitely scope for us to be looking at other parts of local authority services like Neel mentioned in his presentation. So yeah, I think that's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question.
Okay, look, we're coming towards the end of our time, but I've got to cut, and there's one more question to feed in. So, Matey Arundo, I hope I've got your name right. You've got a question in the chat box. Could you introduce yourself and put your question, please?
Yeah, I have no camera, sorry, not working. But my name is Maite. I'm working on a new project on monitoring and evaluation homelessness services across Europe. It's a 3-year project that has been just launched, and it promotes digitalization in the homelessness sectors. And we were wondering what kind of data we can ask these homelessness providers, and how can we manage this. And I was wondering, how do you have structure organize this, and how can we have access to this kind of form or information about that? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have service providers feeding data into this system. So it's largely on accommodation stays. So things like, the data is kind of structured as events. So when an accommodation event sort of started and ended, those are the kinds of data fields that we're feeding through from the providers. And again, offline would be happy to share a sort of template of what that looks like, if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you Thank you so much. Well, as almost at the end of our time, there was one question I just wanted to pick up from Marion. Anna, she was asking, the work you do, is it just shared with local authorities, or do you make it available to other homelessness organisations?
Yeah, so currently the tool is available to the organisations that are providing data, so local authorities, as well as homelessness charities, but specifically those who are feeding data into the system, which I think is about 9 organisations at the moment. I think we do have an ambition to be able to open up some of this data more widely, so we can give access to other organisations and to kind of researchers and things. But yeah, we just sort of working through some of the kind of data quality and matching stuff that I mentioned previously. But it's very much an ambition for us to open this out a bit more, given that it is kind of aggregated insights rather than individuals.
Brilliant. All right, look, if someone else has got a burning comment or question they'd like to raise, please signal to me. Use the raised hand function and I'll bring you in. Otherwise, I'm going to start to conclude. Anyone got a burning final question? If not, thank you. Huge thanks to Neel and Anna for these presentations. I think really quite uplifting in terms of what they say about our ability to address and tackle homelessness and particularly homelessness prevention issues more effectively. Huge thanks to Sam Fripp and others at Centre for Homelessness Impact for organising this meeting. And it was great to see such a super turnout, lots of really excellent comments and questions. I'm so sorry we haven't been able to do all the comments in the chat box justice, but huge thanks for everyone for being here. Naturally, we'll let you have details of our next meeting soon. The centre will circulate the slides presented today following this meeting. In the meantime, before we circulate details of our next meeting, if there's something that you'd be particularly keen to see discussed at future meetings of this group or something you'd like to address, please let me or members of the centre's team know. We're really keen to get colleagues' views. But otherwise, huge thanks again to Neel and Anna, and look forward to getting together again soon. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.